Moving back to manage the old family farm after my grandfather passed wasn't exactly my dream, but it felt like the right thing to do. The place held memories, but also decades of neglect. Buildings sagged, fences needed mending, fields lay fallow. It was overwhelming, lonely work, trying to breathe life back into acres that felt determined to resist. The quiet here was different from the city. Vast, deep, punctuated only by wind, insects, and the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring property. It could feel peaceful, but also profoundly isolating. Among the various outbuildings clustered near the aging farmhouse stood three identical grain silos. Tall, corrugated metal cylinders, monuments to a more prosperous time for the farm. According to Grandpa's scattered records, they hadn't been used in years. Likely empty, maybe home to birds or mice. They were just part of the familiar landscape, structures I'd known since childhood visits, solid, silent, unremarkable. Until the humming started. Or maybe until I finally noticed the humming. It was late one afternoon, the sun dipping low, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. I was walking back to the house after a long day clearing brush near the property line, tired and covered in grime. As I passed the middle silo, the one closest to the path, I heard it. A low, resonant hum, deep, vibrational, almost below the threshold of normal hearing, more felt in my chest than heard with my ears. It seemed to emanate directly from the metal walls of the silo itself. I stopped, head cocked, listening intently. The wind wasn't blowing, no machinery was running nearby. Just the crickets starting their evening chorus and this strange, deep hum. It wasn't constant. It pulsed slightly, waxing and waning with an uneven rhythm. I walked closer, placing my hand flat against the cool, slightly rusted metal. I could feel the vibration distinctly through my palm, a steady thrumming from within the sealed structure. What could possibly make that noise inside an empty silo? My logical mind searched for explanations. Trapped animal? Unlikely to create such a deep, resonant hum. Wind resonating through vents? Maybe, but there was no wind, and the sound felt too regular, too mechanical, almost. Old machinery left inside somehow still active. Grandpa wasn't known for leaving things running, and definitely not inside a sealed silo for years. I circled the base, checking the heavy access hatch near the bottom. Bolted shut, rusted tight, no obvious way in or out. The humming persisted, a low, steady presence. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The sound wasn't loud enough to hear clearly from the house, but the knowledge of it was unsettling. My imagination filled the void of explanation with increasingly disturbing possibilities. Was something hidden in there? Something alive? Or something operating? The silo, once a familiar landmark, now felt alien, mysterious, potentially menacing. Its silent, cylindrical bulk seemed to watch the house in the darkness. Over the next few days, the sound became an obsession. I'd find excuses to walk past the silo multiple times a day, listening. Sometimes the humming was there, low and pulsing. Other times, silence. There seemed no rhyme or reason to its presence or absence. One sweltering afternoon, I heard something different. Not the hum, but a series of rhythmic, metallic thuds coming from inside. Thud. Pause. Thud. Pause. Thud. Like something heavy, metallic, striking the interior wall repeatedly. My blood ran cold. That couldn't be the wind. It couldn't be an animal. It sounded deliberate, methodical, trapped, trying to get out. Or was it the sound of something working? The thudding continued for maybe a minute, then stopped abruptly. Silence returned, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the heat. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. This was beyond strange. It was deeply unnerving. An empty, sealed silo should be silent. Mine wasn't. I considered trying to force the access hatch open, get a ladder, check the top fence, find out what was inside. But a powerful sense of caution, bordering on fear, held me back. What if opening it unleashed something dangerous? What if the sounds were a warning? The silo felt like a Pandora's box on my own property, its contents unknown and potentially hazardous. The mystery was maddening, but the potential consequences of solving it felt even worse. Who seals something inside a grain silo? I tried researching old farm equipment, looking for anything that might produce such sounds, anything Grandpa might have stored and forgotten. Nothing matched. I subtly asked the elderly neighbor down the road about the silos, if he remembered anything unusual about them. He just shrugged, said they'd been there as long as he could remember. Hadn't seen them used in decades. No help there. The secret of the silo remained locked within its metal walls. The sounds continued intermittently. Sometimes the low hum, sometimes the rhythmic thudding, occasionally just silence that felt heavy with anticipation. I started avoiding that part of the yard, taking longer routes back to the house, unwilling to confront the unsettling acoustics. The silo became a focal point of my anxiety about the farm, a physical manifestation of the unknown challenges and potential hidden dangers lurking on this land. I was trying to tame. It disrupted the fragile peace I was seeking. One evening, walking back very late after fixing a fence break under moonlight, I saw something that solidified my fear. A faint, flickering light emanated from the small ventilation slit near the very top of the humming silo. Not a steady light, but inconsistent, like a weak flashlight beam moving around inside, or perhaps sparks from some internal process. It lasted only a few seconds, then vanished, plunging the silo back into darkness. But I had seen it. Something, or someone, was definitely inside. I didn't approach. I retreated quickly to the relative safety of the farmhouse, locking the doors behind me. The humming, the thudding, now the light, it pointed to something active, hidden, deliberately concealed within that rusting metal tower. Was someone living in there? Conducting some illicit activity? Using the farm's isolation as cover? The possibilities were terrifyingly real and mundane, yet felt profoundly sinister in the context of the strange sounds and the sealed nature of the structure. I never did open the silo. The fear of what I might find or who I might disturb was too great. The sounds continued, an unsettling soundtrack to my solitary life on the farm. The silo stands there still a silent enigma. During the day, but sometimes in the quiet hours of the evening or the dead of night, the low hum returns a resonant reminder of the unknown presence sharing my isolated patch of land. It's a secret I live with, a constant, low-level thrum of anxiety emanating from the heart of the familiar. Taking over this small family ranch after Grandpa passed away felt less like fulfilling a destiny and more like shouldering a heavy, quiet responsibility. The place was worn down, nestled miles from anything resembling a town, surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods that seemed to press in from all sides. Days were long, filled with the physical labor of mending fences, clearing fields, tending to the handful of cattle left. Evenings were quieter still, the silence broken only by the wind or the distant cry of a coyote. Loneliness was a constant companion out here, a trade-off for the peace I thought I craved. Good help was essential, and finding it was near impossible. That's why Caleb felt like such a blessing. He'd shown up about a year prior, barely 20, quiet but eager to work, seeming to absorb the rhythms of the ranch almost instinctively. He wasn't chatty, preferred the company of the animals and the land, but his reliability was unquestionable. He learned the property quickly, especially the sprawling woods bordering the North Ridge, a place I mostly avoided, but where he often found shortcuts checking the extensive fence lines. His comfort in those woods, his quiet competence, made his sudden disappearance all the more jarring and inexplicable. It shattered the fragile sense of stability I'd been trying to build. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp and clear. He grabbed a canteen and some wire cutters, heading out for a routine check of the north fence line. Said he'd track a section that often got damaged by deer and be back by lunch. Simple task. When lunchtime passed, then mid-afternoon, a small seed of worry started to grow. Caleb was punctual, methodical. By sunset, worry had bloomed into full-blown fear. He wasn't back. He wouldn't just wander off. Something had happened. My calls to his cell went straight to voicemail. The vast, indifferent silence of the ranch suddenly felt menacing. Calling the sheriff felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging the worst possibilities. Sheriff Brody and his deputy arrived, their faces grimly familiar with the dangers of this remote country. The search started at dawn. Them, me, a few volunteers from neighboring ranches miles away. We focused on the North Ridge, retracing Caleb's likely path, calling his name until our voices were raw. We found nothing. No sign of a fall. No tracks indicating he'd gotten lost or doubled back. No scraps of clothing. Nothing. It was eerie, profoundly unsettling, like the woods themselves had simply erased him. 3 days we searched. 3 days of exhausting hiking, dwindling hope, and the constant, heavy presence of the silent woods. The official search was being scaled back. Resources were needed elsewhere. The volunteers went home, offering quiet condolences. I felt hollowed out, standing alone at the edge of those trees, the weight of failure pressing down. Then, late that afternoon, as I was heading back to the house, defeated, I saw him, emerging from the trees near the main gate, stumbling slightly, clothes ripped, face and arms covered in scratches. Caleb, he was back. The wave of relief was dizzying, almost knocking me off my feet. I ran towards him, shouting his name. But as I got closer, the relief froze, replaced by a chilling wrongness. He didn't react to my voice. He didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, utterly vacant. Caleb? Are you hurt? What happened? The questions tumbled out, but he offered no response, no sign he even heard me. He just stood there, swaying slightly, a layer of dirt and grime masking his familiar features, but unable to hide the terrifying emptiness in his gaze. Leading him back to the bunkhouse was like guiding an automaton. He moved stiffly, without recognition of the path or the buildings. Inside his small room, surrounded by his few belongings, he showed no familiarity. He simply sat on the edge of his cot when I guided him there, staring blankly at the rough wooden wall. The scratches, the torn clothes, they spoke of an ordeal. But his eyes, they spoke of something else entirely, something far more disturbing than just being lost. It was like the person I knew hadn't come back, only his body. When Sheriff Brody returned, alerted by my call, the situation became even clearer and more baffling. Caleb sat passively, offering no answers, no flicker of recognition, even for the familiar face of the sheriff. Where he been? He didn't know, or couldn't say. How did he survive? Silence? Did he see anyone? Did anything happen to him? Just that blank, unnerving stare. Brody tried different approaches, firm, gentle, concerned, but got nothing. It wasn't defiance. It was absence. The clinic in town ran tests. Physically, apart from dehydration, exhaustion, and superficial injuries consistent with stumbling through dense woods, he was fine. No concussion, no broken bones, no drugs. The doctor, perplexed, diagnosed severe shock and probable dissociative amnesia. The mind does strange things to protect itself from trauma, he explained kindly. Being lost out there alone for days. It's terrifying. He might need time, specialized therapy, for the memories, for himself, to surface again. It sounded reasonable, plausible, but it didn't feel right. The emptiness in Caleb's eyes felt too profound, too absolute for just shock. He stayed at the ranch for another week while arrangements were made. His routine, if you could call it that, was minimal. He barely moved from the bunkhouse cot during the day unless prompted. He'd eat mechanically if I sat with him and reminded him. Otherwise, he'd just sit staring. The silence emanating from the bunkhouse felt heavy, unnatural. But the nights were worse. Drawn by some uneasy feeling, I'd find myself looking out my bedroom window towards his small cabin. And often he'd be outside, standing in the yard, utterly still, facing the dark woods of the North Ridge. He wasn't pacing, wasn't agitated. He was just staring, for hours sometimes. Was he remembering something? Seeing something I couldn't? Or was it an echo of the trauma his mind stuck on the place where he was lost? I tried approaching him once during these nocturnal vigils. He didn't react until I was very close, then turned his head slowly. Those blank eyes fixing on me without recognition, sending a chill right through me. I retreated, leaving him to his silent communion with the darkness. The horses in the corral would get skittish when he was near. The ranch dogs would whine and avoid the bunkhouse. They sensed it too, the fundamental wrongness. I spent hours agonizing over what could have happened. Did he stumble upon something illegal out there? A hidden drug operation? Poachers who threatened him into silence? Did he witness something so terrifying it broke his mind? Or maybe the simplest explanation was the truest, that the isolation, the fear, the physical hardship of being lost for 3 days had simply been too much, causing a profound psychological break. A retreat so deep within himself that he couldn't find his way back out. This felt less sinister, perhaps, but almost sadder. The day I drove him to the city, to the facility specializing in trauma and memory disorders, was one of the hardest. He sat beside me, silent, staring out the window, but seemingly seeing nothing. Leaving him there felt like abandoning him all over again. The doctors were hopeful, but cautious. Recovery could take months, years, maybe never fully happen. Driving back to the ranch alone, the silence felt heavier than ever. The Northwood seemed darker, holding on to their secret. Caleb was physically safe now, but the real Caleb, the quiet, reliable kid I knew, remained lost somewhere in the blank expanse of those 3 missing days. The ranch felt haunted, not by a ghost, but by the chilling echo of a mind lost in the wilderness. One of the first things you learn running a place like this is to read the land. You notice where the deer browse, where the ground holds water after a rain, how the grass changes with the seasons. It's a constant, quiet dialogue. So, the marks scarring the west pasture that Tuesday morning screamed louder than any alarm bell. They weren't natural. Not tire tracks from my tractor or a neighbor's activity, not the wandering paths of wildlife. These were deliberate, deep, parallel gouges scraped into the damp earth, starting abruptly near the middle of the field and heading straight for the woods. My gut clenched. The west pasture was next in the grazing rotation, but that plan evaporated. Understanding this anomaly took precedence. I walked out, the wet grass soaking my boots, the morning sun glinting off the dew. The marks were stark, brutal. Something heavy had been dragged, requiring immense effort, judging by how deep the lines cut into the soil. Why start here, in the open? Why drag it towards the woods, the hardest direction to move something heavy. It felt illogical, inefficient, and therefore deeply unsettling. Flanking the drag marks were other strange impressions. Not clear footprints, but areas where the grass was crushed and the soil compacted and wide. Almost circular patches, spaced unevenly. It looked like the result of several points of contact, a shuffling, struggling effort, perhaps multiple people wrestling with an awkward, heavy load. Or maybe something else entirely. The lack of clear human prints was odd. It added a layer of strangeness to the already bizarre scene. The sheer physical exertion implied sent a shiver down my spine. As I followed the trail towards the woods, my eyes scanned the ground meticulously. I half expected, half dreaded, finding something more sinister, discarded tools, signs of a struggle, maybe even blood. But there was nothing like that. Instead, I found small, unusual pieces of debris caught in the disturbed earth and clinging to grass stems along the drag path. Tiny, fibrous strands of what looked like very old coarse sacking or burlap. And interspersed with them, even stranger, were thin, brittle fragments of something dark, almost like shattered pieces of old bakelite plastic or perhaps hardened, ancient linoleum. This wasn't farm debris, it wasn't modern trash. It felt old, out of place. Where would fragments of brittle plastic and old burlap come from out here? And why would they be associated with something heavy being dragged into the woods? The questions multiplied, deepening the mystery. The theory of poachers or thieves seemed less likely now. This felt odder, more specific, tied perhaps to the history of the land itself, something long buried and now, for some reason, unearthed and moved. The woods bordering the west pasture were old growth, thick and dark, even in the daytime. The drag marks led right up to the edge, a clear path into the dense undergrowth. Pausing at the tree line, I felt a distinct reluctance to follow. The air felt stiller here, the silence deeper. What secrets did these woods hold? Was I about to stumble upon the answer to the strange trail, or just deeper into confusion and potential danger? The urge to know battled with the instinct for self-preservation. Curiosity, laced with unease, won out. I pushed through the branches, the sudden coolness of the woods raising goosebumps. The trail was fainter on the forest floor, covered in decades of leaf litter, but still discernible from the broken twigs and unnaturally disturbed leaves. The burlap fibers and brittle dark fragments were sparser here, but still present, confirming the path. I moved slowly, deliberately, trying to be quiet, listening intently. Only the sound of my own breathing and the distant chatter of a squirrel broke the silence. It felt like trespassing, not just on the land, but into some unknown narrative. After maybe 30 or 40 yards of careful progress, the trail opened into a small, unexpected clearing, dappled in shadow, and there, the drag marks ceased. The ground in the clearing was heavily disturbed, the earth churned up, leaves scattered, small saplings bent or broken. It looked like the site of significant activity, the endpoint of the dragging. The strange, shuffling pressure marks were concentrated here. But whatever object had been hauled with such effort was gone completely. There was no sign of burial, no remnants, nothing. Just the scarred earth and the lingering presence of intense, unexplained effort. I spent a good 20 minutes searching the clearing and its immediate surroundings. I found a few more brittle fragments of the dark material, one slightly larger piece showing a faint, indecipherable pattern before crumbling in my fingers. I found more burlap fibers clinging to a low bush, but nothing to indicate what the object was or where it had gone from this point. It felt like reaching the end of a sentence that just trailed off into nonsense. Frustration mingled with a growing sense of the uncanny. This wasn't just weird. It felt fundamentally wrong. Leaving the woods felt like stepping back into the normal world, but the normalcy was fractured. The drag marks were still there, a tangible riddle etched across the pasture. I called Sheriff Brody, though I knew how it would sound. Suspicious ground disturbance. He came out, listened patiently, walked the trail, looked at the strange fragments I'd collected in a plastic bag. He admitted it was peculiar. Maybe related to illegal dumping from years ago. Maybe some long-forgotten farm implement finally succumbing to rust and being moved by resourceful scrappers. Plausible deniability. Nothing concrete to investigate. The official report closed the loop, but the mental loop remained open for me. The drag marks eventually vanished under sun and rain. The grass healed over the scars. But the memory persisted. The abrupt start in the field's center, the immense effort implied, the bizarre debris, the terminus in the hidden clearing. It felt like witnessing the final scene of a play whose characters and plot remained entirely unknown. It left the West Pasture feeling haunted not by ghosts, but by the weight of an unanswered question, a physical disturbance hinting at secrets the land wasn't ready to yield. Choosing this farm, this life, was a deliberate step away from the noise and chaos of the city. I craved the quiet horizon, the predictable rhythm of the seasons, the feeling of self-sufficiency, even if it meant long hours and a persistent solitude. The farmhouse sits back from the quiet county road, buffered by a field I plant with corn each spring. It felt like my own small kingdom, peaceful and contained, until the evenings started to feel observed, until he started appearing. The first time I barely registered him. It was dusk, that hazy time when light softens and shadows lengthen. I was tinkering with an old cultivator near the barn, thinking about dinner. My eyes scanned the cornfield, tracking the flight of a hawk, and landed on a figure standing motionless at the far edge, where the field met the road shoulder. Just a dark silhouette against the vibrant sunset. Tall, still. My immediate thought was a motorist needing help. I raised a hand in a hesitant wave. No response. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the distance and fading light obscured everything. A moment later, I glanced back from putting tools away, and he was gone. Easy to forget. But the next evening, he was back. Same spot, same time, just as the sun dipped low. Same unnerving stillness, facing my house. This time, the coincidence felt too sharp. Curiosity warred with a nascent unease. I started walking across the yard towards the road, intending to call out to offer assistance. Before I'd covered half the distance, he turned, not hurried, but deliberately, and melted into the deeper shadows pooling beneath the trees that lined the road beyond the field. He didn't run. He simply ceased to be visible, like smoke dissipating. That's when the real disquiet set in. This wasn't someone needing help. This felt purposeful. Why stand there? Why watch my house? Why disappear when approached? Over the next few nights, I became hyper-aware. I'd find reasons to be outside around sunset, watching the edge of the field. And almost every evening, he'd appear. Sometimes just for a few minutes, sometimes longer. Always silent, always still, always facing my property. His predictability was, in itself, unnerving. It felt like he wanted to be seen, but only from a distance. I tried different tactics. One night, I stayed inside, watching from a darkened window. He still appeared, stood for his usual duration, then vanished. Another night, I tried getting closer under the cover of the barn and some overgrown lilac bushes. I got near enough to confirm he was male, tall, dressed in dark, perhaps layered clothing. But the twilight and the distance still kept his features frustratingly indistinct. The way he stood, not relaxed, but rigidly attentive, amplified the feeling that this wasn't aimless loitering. It was surveillance. My peaceful solitude began to feel like vulnerable isolation. The wide open fields offered no cover. The quiet house felt exposed. Who was he? A disgruntled neighbor I hadn't met? Unlikely. The nearest farm was miles off. Someone casing the place for robbery? Possible, but his behavior seemed too passive, too ritualistic almost. Was it someone connected to the previous owner? Someone with a grievance or an attachment to the land? My mind cycled through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Sleep became lighter, punctuated by waking moments where I felt compelled to check the windows facing the cornfield. I'd bought motion-activated floodlights, installing them on the barn and house corners facing the road. Maybe light would deter him. The first few nights, they blazed on frequently, triggered by deer wandering close or owls swooping low. But they never illuminated the watcher. He seemed to anticipate their range, always standing just outside the pool of light, his silhouette sometimes briefly visible against the darkness beyond the glare before he retreated. It felt like he was adapting, learning my defenses. The feeling of being watched became interwoven with the chilling sense of being studied. I finally mentioned it to Martha, who ran the feed store in the nearest town, the closest thing to a local confidant I had. I described the figure, the routine. She frowned, listened intently, but shook her head. Didn't recognize the description. Hadn't heard any local gossip about strangers lurking around. Could be just some oddball passing through, she offered, trying to be reassuring. Or maybe someone thinks you're someone else. Her suggestions, meant to comfort, only highlighted the unnerving lack of explanation. The constant vigilance was exhausting. The not knowing was worse. After nearly 2 weeks of this silent nightly observance, I reached a breaking point. One evening, seeing his familiar shape materialize against the sunset, I didn't hide or approach cautiously. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight I kept by the door and strode directly out towards the road. Adrenaline thrummed through me, a mixture of fear and anger. I stopped at the edge of my property line, maybe 20 yards from him, and shone the beam directly at him. He didn't flinch, didn't shield his eyes. The powerful beam illuminated him fully for the first time. He was older than I thought, maybe 50s, gaunt face, deeply shadowed eyes, wearing a long, dark, worn-looking coat. His expression was utterly blank, devoid of anger, fear, or recognition. He just stared back into the light, motionless. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice tight. "Why are you watching my house every night? Leave me alone." He didn't speak, didn't react verbally at all. We stood locked in that tableau for what felt like minutes. Me with the light, him bathed in its glare, the crickets suddenly seeming deafeningly loud. Then, with excruciating slowness, he lowered his head slightly, almost like a nod, turned, and began walking calmly down the shoulder of the road away from my farm. He didn't hurry. He didn't look back. He just walked into the deepening darkness until I couldn't see him anymore. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. The confrontation was over, but the resolution felt hollow, incomplete. His blank expression, his silent departure, it explained nothing. It only deepened the mystery. He didn't appear the following evening, nor the nights after. The spot by the cornfield remained empty. The immediate pressure lifted, but the unease settled deeper, changing from acute fear to a chronic, low-level anxiety. Why had he been there? What was the significance of that final, slow nod? Was it acknowledgement, a warning, or just the vacant gesture of someone profoundly detached? I never saw him again. but the quiet evenings felt forever altered. The memory of that blank face and the flashlight beam, the feeling of being singled out for silent, inexplicable scrutiny, lingered like a phantom limb. The solitude I sought now carried the faint, persistent echo of unwelcome observation. Living out here, nestled in a valley with rolling hills and ridges defining the horizon, you get used to the vastness, the sense of scale. The nearest neighbor is miles away. My little cabin and the patch of land around it feel like a tiny island in a sea of wilderness. It's why I moved here, for the solitude, the quiet, the feeling of being away from it all. But that same isolation, that same wide open space, can become unsettling when you realize you might not be as alone as you thought. It started subtly, a feeling more than a distinct sighting. Just a prickle on the back of my neck, sometimes when I was outside working in the garden or chopping wood. A sense that I was being observed. I'd scan the surrounding hillsides, the long, undulating ridge that formed the western boundary of my view, but see nothing. Just trees, rocks, waving grass. Easy to dismiss as nerves, the product of too much silence, too much solitude. Until the day I actually saw them. I was sitting on my porch late one afternoon, enjoying the cool breeze that often swept down from the hills as the sun began to set. My eyes drifted up towards the western ridge, tracing its familiar silhouette against the deepening blue sky. And that's when I saw them. Not one, but 3 distinct figures, standing perfectly still, spaced evenly along the crest of the ridge. They were too far away to make out any details, just upright silhouettes, dark against the sky. They looked like people, just standing there, watching. It was unnerving. The ridge was miles away, technically not my property, but visible from almost everywhere on my land. Why would 3 people just stand up there like statues? Hikers taking a break? Except they weren't moving at all. And there were no visible trails leading up that steep, rocky section of the ridge. I watched them for maybe 20 minutes, sipping my cooling coffee, until the fading light made them almost impossible to distinguish from the rocks and scraggly pines. When I looked again a few minutes later, they seemed to be gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was hikers, strangely still ones. Maybe it was an optical illusion, tricks of light and shadow as sunset approached. But the image stuck with me, 3 silent figures, perfectly spaced, observing my valley, my cabin. The next day, I found myself scanning the ridge constantly as I went about my chores. Nothing all morning. Then, mid-afternoon, they were back. Same spots, same stillness. 4 figures this time. My stomach tightened. 4? This wasn't hikers pausing. This felt intentional. They were watching my property. There was no other reason for them to be standing there, so exposed for so long. I grabbed my binoculars, the cheap pair I kept for birdwatching. Focusing on the distant ridge, the image swam into view, shaky in my unsteady hands. They were definitely human shapes, dressed in dark, indistinct clothing. Still too far to see faces or details, but undeniably people. Standing stock still, facing my direction, watching. Who were they? What did they want? There was no obvious answer. This wasn't ranch country where disputes over land or livestock were common. I kept mostly to myself. Had I unknowingly trespassed somewhere? Offended someone? Or was this something more random, more sinister? The possibilities felt vast and threatening. The sheer distance was part of the horror. They were too far away to confront, too remote to easily identify, yet close enough to feel like a constant, unnerving presence. They remained there all afternoon. As dusk fell, I watched through the binoculars until their shapes blended completely into the darkening ridge. I went inside, locked the doors, drew the curtains, feeling exposed and vulnerable even within my own walls. Sleep was fitful. I kept imagining those silent figures still up there on the ridge, watching my cabin through the night. The thought was deeply unsettling. What kind of person spends hours, even overnight, just standing on a remote, windswept ridge? The next morning, fueled by anxiety and lack of sleep, I looked towards the ridge first thing. They were gone. Relief warred with suspicion. Was it over? Or was this part of their pattern? Intermittent observation, designed to keep me guessing, keep me on edge. I spent the day jumpy, constantly scanning the horizon. Around lunchtime, they reappeared. 2 figures this time, in slightly different positions along the ridge, but just as still, just as focused in my direction. This continued for over a week. Sometimes 2 figures, sometimes 3 or 4, occasionally none at all. They appeared at different times of day, stayed for hours, always motionless, always facing my valley. Their presence became a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in my life. The beautiful, expansive views I had cherished now felt menacing. The silence of the valley seemed to amplify the feeling of being watched. My sense of peaceful isolation shattered, replaced by a paranoid vigilance. I considered calling the authorities, but what could I report? People standing on a distant public ridge? They weren't trespassing, weren't making threats. It sounded like the ramblings of a paranoid hermit. I felt trapped, unable to act, forced to simply endure the silent, unnerving surveillance. Why were they doing it? Was it targeted harassment? Psychological intimidation? Or were they waiting for something? Waiting for me to leave? Waiting for an opportunity? The ambiguity was maddening. One afternoon, determined to do something, I drove my truck out to the base of the ridge, intending to hike up to confront them or at least get a closer look. It was rough terrain, no clear path. As I started scrambling up the steep incline, pushing through thorny brush, I glanced up towards the crest where I'd last seen 2 figures. They were gone, vanished in the short time it took me to drive over and start climbing. Had they seen me coming? Were they watching my approach that closely? Defeated and unnerved, I abandoned the climb. They were always one step ahead, reacting to my movements, maintaining their distance, their anonymity. It felt like a cruel, calculated game. I drove back to the cabin feeling more helpless than ever. That evening, as the sun set, I looked towards the ridge. 5 figures this time, spread out along the crest, dark sentinels against the dying light. More than ever before. It felt like an escalation, a silent statement. We are still here, we are watching. And we are growing. The vast empty landscape suddenly felt terrifyingly crowded. My safe haven had become a fishbowl,